think it's time to blow this scene. Get everybody in the stuff together. Okay, 3, 2, 1, let's jam.
Roy, how are you? This is Jamie Carreno. Thank you for your time on this.
Oh, it's okay. I hope I'm not too groggy. We did 6 hours of filming, for a documentary today, so I'm a little groggy, but I'll try to keep alert here.
No worries. Thank you very much. Right. So let's start with our call. And first of all, I want just to thank you, Roy Thomas, and John Simenes, your manager, for having this time to talk to us here at Documentos Clasificados. As I mentioned it to John, Roy, this is for the Latin American market.
Can I ask where you are?
My name is Jamie Carreno.
No,
I'm located right now in Ottawa. I'm in Ottawa, Canada.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
correct. That's correct.
Okay. Never been in Ottawa. I've been in Canada a number of times, but I don't know about Ottawa, yeah.
Yeah, okay, I see.
I just like
Normally what we
do is.
Yeah. Well, what we do here is for the Latin American market. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna interview you, and then I'm gonna put it in our podcast, and I'm gonna translate it into Spanish. So right now we're gonna do it just in English, and later on we're gonna translate it in Spanish. So anyway, so without further comments, I will do it. Don't worry about it. So all the questions right now are gonna be in English. Don't worry about it. Don't worry.
Okay.
So first of all, it's an honor to having you in the interview. To be honest, it's really an honor. So I want to ask you the first question is.
Sure.
You were editor-in-chief for Marvel, and you fill out the shoes of Stan Lee, and I will say you fill it quite well. Can you tell us which were the first or the most complicated things that you have to deal when you took that position?
The most complicated thing I had to deal with what? You mean
when you took over as editor in Marvel? Yeah, editor-in-chief at Marvel.
You mean as the editor? When I took over as the editor? Is that what you mean?
That's correct.
Well, the most unpleasant thing, I don't know if it was exactly complicated, but I had been very used to coming in only about 2 or maybe 3 days a week, and the other days I would stay at home and write, as did Stan.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden when I became, the editor-in-chief in 1972, when Stan became publisher, all of a sudden I had to start coming in 5 days a week again. I didn't like that. I don't know if that was complicated. It was kind of unpleasant. But the main thing was that I had to start handling all the covers. I mean, they were still subject to Stan. His eventual approval. He was the publisher. Just as before that, he had been editor, and the ultimate approval had been the original publisher, Martin Goodwin. But that was one of the most complicated things. I had to put out, anywhere 10 or so covers a week that I would call one or several artists in, and we just sit around and look at photocopies of the stories and try to come up with a good cover scene, that would help sell the comic. And that was something I hadn't done before. I'd come up with a cover here, a cover there, but now suddenly I would sit there and have to come up with 5 or 10 covers in a row with an artist like Gil Kane, who would come in and do a bunch of cover sketches at the same time, or maybe Marie Severin. And that was kind of twisted because after you do 2 or 3, they all start looking alike. It's some hero fighting some villain, and how many ways can you do that? When it's the same artist and the same writer. So everything was complicated, and I had to deal with a bunch of different writers. And dealing with the writers and artists wasn't such a change because I'd already been doing that to some extent. So I just had to do a little more of it. But all of a sudden there were these new things, handling the covers and overseeing the cover copy, and I had to know how to delegate authority, so I didn't try to do too much, or else I'd, wear myself out and I wouldn't be any good to anybody. But it was a job that was quite a different job, and I quickly discovered I didn't care that much for it. So by the time I left it a couple of years later, I was ready to leave.
And you, correct me if I'm wrong, Roy, you were the editor-in-chief when the famous or infamous Death of Gwen Stacy. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, I don't know if it's the best connection. I don't. Can you say
no?
When what happened? I was editor-in-chief when what happened?
You were the editor-in-chief when the famous story of Gwen Stacy, when the night of Gwen Stacy died.
Oh yeah.
You were the editor-in-chief.
I had just become the editor-in-chief. Yeah. Just a couple of months or so before. Actually, for a few weeks, I was officially story editor, and I wasn't editor-in-chief, but that's another story. But I was doing about the same thing both times. Yeah, what happened is that John Romita, who had of course been the second and very important artist of Spider-Man, was the sort of editorial director at that stage, and he was sort of in charge of. He was supposed to be the overlooking on behalf of Stan and me. Stan more than me even. He was supposed to keep a special eye on Spider-Man. That was our top seller. And John was supposed to keep a special eye on it to make sure it was going all right so that Stan and I didn't have to keep looking at it every minute. And Jerry Conway had just taken over a couple of issues earlier as the writer, and he was doing a fine job. And he was working with, Gil Kane as the third regular penciler, I guess. And somehow between the two of them, and they became convinced, and maybe they were right, that Spider-Man needed to be kind of shaken up a little bit after a little over, about 115 or 20 issues, that they needed to do something different with Spider-Man. And since Marvel didn't kill off that many characters in those days, nowadays I think they kill off character in the comic every couple of minutes, But back then they didn't kill off that many people permanently in the comics, so they decided that somebody should die in the comic book, somebody important. And between the two of them, and I think John said it was Jerry, and Jerry said it was John, but they came up between them with the idea that it should be Gwen Stacy because, if they had killed off, say, Aunt May, well, she was always dying anyway, it seemed, so that wouldn't be a big threat. Mm-hmm. There wasn't anybody else of any importance, so they decided, what if we actually kill off Spider-Man's girlfriend? Nobody's going to believe that's going to happen. That'll really shake things up. And so they came to me and convinced me that, I don't know. I said, I know how Stan will take this, but, I didn't care one way or the other. But, let's go see what Stan thinks. It seems to, it certainly would be an interesting storyline. It would shake things up. And Stan didn't care much for the idea. That's why he later convinced himself that he didn't know about it in advance. But he did. We wouldn't have killed her off without.
I believe you. I believe you, Roy. I believe you.
Yeah. Later on, he started telling people that we killed Gwen Stacy off while he was out of town on vacation or something. But as I always said, John Romita's mother, Jerry Conway's mother, and my mother did not raise any children stupid enough to kill Spider-Man's girlfriend while Stan Lee was out of town. We just wouldn't have done it. So he gave his permission rather grudgingly. Because he had just killed, when he was writing the strip a year or so earlier, he had killed off her father, Captain Stacy, and he said it was going to look like Marvel Comics had a grudge against the whole Stacy family, But he felt, the writer wants it. Even more importantly, John Romita thought it was a good idea, and his editor-in-chief was approving it. So he said, look, I'm not doing it anymore, so go ahead. He regretted it very soon afterward, which is why he talked himself into believing, that he hadn't known about it. But so we killed her off, and the fact that people are still, you're asking about how many years has that been now? It's been that was like
40 something, almost 50.
It's almost.
I guess you did the right thing.
So if nothing else, it showed that they were right about one thing. It was a story with impact, wasn't it? Because people are still talking about it, 48. Years later, and probably will be for another few years. Everything, so it shows that at least we were on the right track. And Stan, of course, began to regret it very soon afterwards. So he I think you may know that he made him bring Gwen back kind of as a clone, for a while, about a year or two later.
Yes, of course, of course.
He saw very quickly. Yeah, but he saw very quickly that didn't really work. It wasn't Gwen. It didn't, so it wasn't the same character, so it wasn't going to work. So he let that go. But it was interesting. Jerry, got very death threats. And this is like before the internet. This is just by letters and stuff. And he couldn't go to a comics convention for a couple of years because he was afraid of somebody attacking him. So I don't know. Maybe he regretted doing it. He might have regretted doing it eventually. But it was an interesting idea. And I just put together a collection of a dozen or so, of the best and most important Spider-Man stories, from the beginning through now. About a dozen or so, 10 or 15 stories like that for a British publisher. They're going to do as a book, a company, Folio Society over in the UK. Okay. And, and that became one of the stories, because I figured, well, how could you ignore a story that people, threaten to kill
everything, That's right. Okay. Now,
so that was like, one of the more important stories after Stan left.
Of course. Yeah. Of course. Roy. Now, change a little bit of a gear. I know that you are responsible for bringing the lines of Conan to Marvel, where you did such wonderful stories. Yeah, you adapted a lot of the work.
Yeah.
Can you tell us something about it? How do you feel about your contribution to Conan? For me, you are the greatest Conan writer ever.
Well, No. Even if I was really good, and you may be exaggerating that just a little, but even if I was, neither I nor anybody else is ever going to be the greatest Conan writer ever, besides Robert E. Howard, who made up the character, and everything. I've put my stuff against the stuff that L. Sprague de Camp and these guys were writing, and they were writing prose, and I was doing comics. But the stories, I think my stuff holds up okay compared to most people who've done it. But Robert E. Howard was the real inspiration. Everybody else's stuff kind of pales before him because he's the original, and nobody can ever really match him. I was reading a couple of the stories just the other day and thinking, this guy really was weird. He really lived this stuff, and he made that character, come to life. And he made me. I wasn't a fan of that kind of fiction, what they call sword and sorcery. I didn't like it that much. It wasn't my kind of thing, really. I liked Arthurian adventure, King Arthur and things, but I wasn't big into that sword and sorcery thing. But once I discovered Conan and really read the stories, I became a real fan. And I think that's one of the things that drove me that first 10 years, when I wrote it, and then even when I came back to it, is the fact that I became really a fan of the material. I wasn't just doing it, because I thought it would be a good-selling comic book, although that's why I got into it. But eventually, or very quickly, I became enough of an admirer of the character and an admirer of Robert E. Howard's writing that I really wanted to bring that character and some of Robert E. Howard's prose adapted into comics form to a different audience and a wider audience, and then make them go back and want to read the original stories. And while I was doing that, I wanted to make a few bucks for myself in Marvel Comics too. Of course, that was my job.
And you were able to work with John Buscema, who I understand is based on some interviews you did to him on your Alter Ego magazine, that he didn't like superheroes, but he liked this kind of comics, Conan.
Yeah.
So you got the best of him.
John was a good artist, but, he didn't. A lot of artists, the thing is, we as fans, not every fan, but I as fans, and a lot of fans I know, really like superheroes. But the thing we have to remember is, especially with the older, they're mostly gone now, but that original crew of people that came into the field in the 40s, the 50s, which is when John did, he came in the very late 40s, they didn't really like superheroes particularly. They were interested in other kinds of comic stories. They liked Tarzan, maybe, who's not quite as close to a superhero. They liked Prince Valiant, and Flash Gordon and things like that. But they weren't really fans of Superman or Batman. Maybe they liked it okay, but they didn't have any great desire to draw superheroes. And John didn't either because, he was a very good draftsman, as you know. He could draw almost anything. And, what did he want to draw a bunch of guys flying around in capes for? But he loved drawing Conan. He had never heard of Conan, never read Conan, but after I sent him the stories, and he read a few of them, he said, this is the kind of thing I've been wanting to draw all my life. So he was really eager to do it.
So there you go. You got another great decision to bring it Marvel and bring it Conan to Marvel and bring it that kind of an artist like John Buscema to this kind of work. Good job. Well, here's another question for you. I know. Go ahead.
Of course, John didn't get to draw it at first because it turned out that the publisher felt that he was too expensive, and he was paying out a little money for the rights to Conan, and he wanted to get that back. So we ended up with this young guy who was over in Britain, Barry Smith, and he did a great job. But then John came in, and did it later on. So we ended up with 2 or 3 really good artists on that first few years of Conan. We had Barry Smith first, then Gil Kane came in and did a couple of issues, and then John Buscema came in and became the regular issues. Conan was really blessed by having some really good artists, and I was lucky to get to work with. They were so different. There's very little similarity, especially between the work of Barry Smith and John Buscema, and yet they were the 2 definitive, Conan comic book artists. Really, nobody else comes even close.
Artists, yeah, of course. Now let me change a little bit to DC. I know, and it's well known that your love for the Justice Society, and you were in charge of writing several stories about them in several incarnations. There's one in particular you are more proud about, or there's one that you didn't have the chance to write, and maybe, too bad I didn't write this story that I was about to write, but didn't have the chance, didn't think about it, or the editor didn't approve it?
You mean a DC character? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, that's right, the DC character. That's correct.
DC character. Since I wrote that DC Comic All-Star Squadron, I had so many people in it, and I got a chance to write almost everybody for at least a few panels. I suppose if I went and looked at it, there were some characters that I would have liked to have done a little more with. I think I only brought the Earth 2 Aquaman in right at the end, and there were other characters I didn't use very much, but if I wrote a character a lot in All-Star Squadron, it was probably because I really wanted to write him. I was interested in, Robot Man and Johnny Quick and characters like that. At Marvel, I got a chance to write, too, almost all the characters I really wanted to write. I mean, later on, you had characters like, Howard the Duck and a few others, but I didn't have any great desire to write those. They were good characters, but they weren't something I had a desire to write. I got a chance to write most of the characters I really loved at Marvel. My favorite Marvel character was The Thing, since the first time I saw him in Fantastic Four #1, and I got a chance to write him quite a bit,
Yeah, of course. But any story in particular that you is still within your, I don't know, maybe the editor didn't like it, or you were thinking and maybe didn't realize? There's nothing in particular. Do you think that, I wish I could write that story about it?
I'm not sure what you're. Are you saying that was there something that I did that some editor didn't like?
Yeah, no. So actually, you didn't. No, a story that you didn't write for any reason that you regret you didn't write because it was either not accepted or something. Do you have any?
No, I didn't have the thing is, I was always just thinking about 1 or 2 months ahead. I mean, I might have it. With Conan, I had a general direction of where I was going because I knew what his life was. It had been lined up by Howard. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I had an idea of something that was coming up, and, maybe a year from now I'd do this or that. But usually, I sort of knew the general direction I was going in, and I just came up with stories, whatever I needed one every month. I would sit down and, okay, let's see, where were we? Now, where are we going? And I'd just sit down and write something. So when I would leave a book or leave the company, for that matter, I didn't have a lot of stories in my head that I was thinking, oh boy, I had about 20 stories like that, but I didn't get a chance to write them. What it really was is simply that if I had been scheduled to write another story, I'd have come up with one, But I suppose there were certain stories I would think about sometime. There are stories I'd say, well, I should do that sometime, and then I didn't get around to it. But if I didn't get around to it, probably, because I didn't care quite enough, about it. I mean, there were stories like that, but there weren't a lot of great stories that I was thinking, oh, I didn't get a chance to write this, So the only thing I wish I had had a chance to write even more Conan, and I would have liked to have written even more All-Star Squadron, but not so much particular stories. I would just like to have written another 10 or 20 years of those comics.
Mm-hmm. I see.
Yeah.
speaking of characters, Roy, when you wrote the Avengers and the West Coast Avengers, you were really a force behind the Vision and Wanda. With the new series, I don't know, have you seen the series? What you can you tell me something about it? Or you saw the series so far or not? Did you like it?
I've seen the first 3 episodes. I've seen the first 3 episodes. It's very interesting because it's sort of done as this. On the one hand, it's like a sort of a parody of television situation comedies over the years, and each episode, it seems like it goes another 10 years. You start off with situation comedies from the 50s or 60s, and then by the next show, you're up to the 70s and 80s and so forth. And at the same time, it's not just that, because you are sort of aware of the fact, if you know these characters at all, at least, that there's something else going on, and there's something sinister. It may be done as kind of a comedy, and the actors treat it like they're in a situation comedy, but of course you're aware of the fact there's something really sinister going on. There are occasional hints, a voice over a phone, or someone crawling out of a manhole cover, and Wanda does a kind of a magical rewind on it to kind of keep them at bay. And you think, and what is this? Is this some world they're trapped in? Is this a world that Wanda has created because the Vision was killed, and maybe they can only be together if they live in this weird dream world or something? And I confess, I don't know anything more about it than you do. If you've seen the first 3 episodes, I mean, I could, I could guess, but I don't really know. Nobody's told me.
No. I see. That's good. But I like it that they recognize you as one of the force behind that. I'm really happy about that. Now, let's change a little bit. I know, and I've been reading your Alter Ego magazine that you publish for Tomorrow's, and I really like it. And one of the things that I like it about that magazine is you focus more on the creators. Why you took that approach? Why you took that approach?
Actually,
to focus more on the creators than in the characters. Yeah. I love that. I love it.
I sort of drifted into it because in the old days, when I was doing Alter Ego the first time as a fan back in the 60s, we just had articles about the old stories of the comics and the characters, and that was good for that time because those stories weren't available. I mean, if I was writing about the old Captain Marvel, well, you couldn't just go out and pick up a book that printed old Captain Marvel stories because they weren't around, So you had to read an article about in a book with a few illustrations to know what they were like. But by the time we started Alter Ego again, about 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago, at least enough stories were out there that if people wanted to see it, they could see a bunch of Captain Marvel stories. They could read the entire run of All-Star Comics, my favorite comic book. They could read all kinds of reprinted Marvel comics and DC comics and other comics. So, but I really got the approach, the idea of doing it as a magazine, which it's not entirely interviews, but where the interviews are very much the focus of a lot of the issues, if not all of them. And as opposed to dealing with the individual stories and just telling you what happened in them, I really sort of picked that up because Alter Ego started off in its new incarnation 20 years ago as the sort of back part of this other magazine, Comic Book Artist, that Tomorrow's had, that had started just before, or that started about that time. And the guy who was running that, John B. Cook, he had a kind of an interview-centered approach. He did interviews, he did articles in depth, he did this and that, and I just seized on the idea that, well, I wasn't going to sit down and write articles in which I read every one of several hundred comics about somebody and just told what happened, and I wasn't going to do huge amounts of research to find out everything that happened. I didn't have the time or energy or ambition to do that because I was also writing comics and doing other things. So I decided that the best thing to do is to do an interview magazine because there, you have to know something about the comic, and I did interviews in the early days, and then I got other better people to do it afterward. But you come up with enough knowledge about the person's career and the person's work that you can ask him questions about it, and then you get the answers from him, and he does a lot of the work, and then you just transcribe it and put it in the magazine. I guess it's the same theory that Andy Warhol had years ago when he did his interview book. And I just felt like we should try to get these people down on tape and then record it into a book while they're still alive. When we started 20 years ago, there were a lot more of the, golden age artists from the 40s and 50s still alive. Now almost nobody is. from that period. And even the people from the so-called Silver Age of the 60s are dying off. So the idea is to sort of, it's a race against time, tell their stories and get them on paper and recorded and so forth while they're still, young enough and vigorous enough to tell you their stories.
Hey, one more question, okay?
One more question, that's correct. So before we finish,
one more.
Roy, is there anything you want to promote you're working on right now so we can conclude our interview? Besides your Alter Ego magazine, maybe your...
I try to keep busy. So I'll just mention a few of the things in case anybody's interested. As I said, that over the next few months, I have a few books coming out from the English publisher, which is Folio Society. It's a prestigious English customer. They've done 3 books with me so far, collecting stories from the Bronze Age, the Silver Age, and the Golden Age. Those are out. And there are 2 more volumes coming out. One is a collection, as I mentioned, of some of the best Spider-Man stories. That comes out in a few months. And the other that comes out before that is a collection of some of the best Captain America stories, in my opinion, from the very beginning through fairly recently, and so forth. From the 40s, from the 50s, from the 60s, and so forth. So those are nice. Let's see. Of course, I do Alter Ego. And I'm really pleased that I've got a big issue coming out in April about centered around my friend Gary Friedrich, who was a childhood friend of mine and the guy who created the Ghost Rider and a couple of other characters at Marvel. I do 3 strips on the internet for Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated. If you look up the Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated website, they have a lot of comic strips there. About every week or so, they add a new strip, and I do 2 Tarzan strips for them. One is adapting Tarzan of the Apes, the original novel, and his story is alive, and the other is new Tarzan stories. And I'm also adapting the John Carter of Mars story, so that's a lot of fun. Keeps my hand in writing comics.
Good.
A few weeks ago, I actually had a Marvel comic come out. King Size Conan had a 10-page Conan story in it by me. I don't have anything else scheduled for Marvel right now, but maybe something else will come out. And let's see, and I'm doing introductions for some Marvel books. They're doing reprints of some of not just the Conan stories I did, but also Cull and a couple of they did a Solomon Kane recently, and I do introductions for some of those books to tell the stories behind them. So, I kind of keep busy between all those things, and I'm trying to get started writing my autobiography before I get too old. So
that could be great.
So that's basically, it. And I guess having turned 80 just a few weeks ago, I guess that's a fairly full schedule for an 80-year-old.
That's good, Roy. Roy, thank you very much again for being here with us at Documentos Clasificados. I really appreciate you and John for your time. And thank you very much. And please be safe. And thank you very much.
Okay. Take care up there in Ottawa. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Take care.